Hey everybody, just want to do a quick lecture. It's pretty short about changing communities. This is chapter 17 in your textbook. So we'll go ahead and get started. Let's see. And switch these. All right, so chapter 17, change in communities. Key concepts we're going to talk about are agents of change act on communities across all temporal and spatial scales. Succession is the process of change in species composition over time as a result of abiotic agents of change. There's been a lot of experimental work on succession, and it shows how mechanisms can be diverse and context dependent. I'm not really going to talk about those, but they are in your textbook. And then communities can follow different successional pathways and display alternate stable states. And I have actually a separate lecture that I'm going to do for you for alternate stable states. So let's get started. So to start with, communities are always changing. It's the one sort of constant. And some change more than others, and that can be spatially or temporally. So they can change more rapidly than others or more than others across space or across time. And also, we know that human actions are becoming one of the strongest forces behind community change, and we have an imperfect understanding of the consequence of those actions. So there's been some fairly recent work related to what is known now as the Anthropocene. There's some discussion about whether or not the term should be used. It hasn't been fully accepted, but there's quite a lot of information out there. And I also just got this book that I started reading called The Human Planet, which is pretty interesting if you're interested in reading more about the Anthropocene. So a couple facts from this book actually about the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is known as the human epoch, and I guess more traditionally it's been called the Holocene, and there are some reasons why it's been called the Holocene versus the Anthropocene. I won't get into that here. If you're interested, I'll refer you to the book I just showed you. So those are just a few facts about the Anthropocene and sort of the effect that humans have had on the Earth. So moving right into the material from the textbook, some agents of change. First of all, let's define succession, and that is simply the change in species composition and communities over time, and this results from both biotic and abiotic factors. So what are the abiotic factors and what are the biotic factors? So let's start with the abiotic factors. They can vary over daily, seasonal, decadal, and longer time scales. You think about climate, soils, nutrients, water, etc. This has important implications for community change. There are abiotic agents of change that fall into two categories. There are those that are categorized as disturbance and those that are categorized as stress. So disturbance are those events that injure or kill some individuals and create opportunities for other individuals. So you can think of natural disturbances such as a tsunami or a hurricane or a tornado or something like that. And then there are also stress, and these are abiotic factors that reduce the growth, reproduction, or survival of individuals. And some examples would be increasing temperature through global climate change, or it could be changes in pH, so decreasing pH in the oceans due to climate change, the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Moving on to biotic factors, there are species interactions that can result in species replacements. So depending on how strong the interaction is, if one species goes extinct, locally it can be replaced and change the community. Diseases can cause death or slow growing of a species or slow growth of a species. And I guess we're maybe in a, can think about that in relation to the current COVID-19 pandemic. And then ecosystem engineers are keystone species that influence community change. So you can think again about the beaver example. So abiotic and biotic factors often interact, and they do so and produce various changes in the community. An example again is the ecosystem engineer causes changes in both the abiotic conditions that result in species replacement. So in our beaver example, you can see that the stream that was flowing through this forested area, the trees have been killed, been cut down by the beavers to build their lodge and for food. They've dammed the stream, and so there have been changes in the stream fauna as well as the nearby riparian area. Agents of change vary in frequency and intensity. So your book talks about the Mount St. Helens eruption quite a bit. It was huge both in magnitude and the area covered, but it was these types of eruptions are really infrequent. So they're the frequency that they happen is really low. They don't happen very often. And then at the other end of the spectrum, such as things such as a falling tree in the forest, are weak disturbances and often frequent. So you can see here in this figure where there is a high intensity. So this would be like a volcanic eruption. So high intensity, but low frequency. And then sometimes we have these, and in this situation these can cause primary succession. So you can imagine through, and we're going to talk about primary and secondary succession later, but you can imagine Mount St. Helens eruption or other volcanic eruptions cause decimation of all life in the area. And so life sort of has to start over, and it starts as a primary succession. And then if we think about trees falling in the forest, you can have lots of these occurring at low or very high frequency, depending on how large the disturbance is, but they have really low intensity. And so these things cause pretty little successional change. Those that have sort of intermediate intensity and intermediate frequency are ripe for secondary succession. And one of the things that scientists are worried about is the increase in frequency of these high intensity disturbances. And that's one of the things that climate scientists are worried about, that there are these increase in these these high magnitude hurricanes and things of that nature that can cause changes across the community, ecological communities. So some basics of succession. Succession involves colonization and extinction due to abiotic and biotic agents of change. In theory, the process goes through this sort of linear series of stages, and ends in a climax stage or climax community. And this is supposedly a stable endpoint where there are little changes. There is quite a bit of discussion about whether or not this actually occurs in this way. But in this figure, you can see that we start with no life. There's primary succession. We end up with a pioneer stage where there are pioneer species that are really tolerant, that lead to this intermediate stage where there may be a mix of species, and eventually you get this what is considered a stable climax stage. And then there are these agents of change that can drive things backwards from time to time too. So you may have a climax stage that a volcano erupts and it drives it all the way back to where there's no life locally, and it has to go through this whole process again. And then in the secondary stage, there's enough of a feedback where there's some life. So you go through secondary succession and then back to this intermediate stage, and you go back eventually to the climax stage. Moving on, so primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession, there is a colonization of habitats that are devoid of life. So you can think again about volcanic rock where there is no life that currently or immediately after the volcanic rock forms, there's no life living there. And through time, and this can be very slow, these early colonizers are pioneer species, and they tend to be really stress tolerant, can develop conditions for other species that can make it hospitable for those other species. So they create habitat eventually for other species. And there's a distinct sort of stage where species go through, or stage in ecological succession that certain species are associated with this, things like bacteria, lichen, and things of that nature. And then secondary succession is the reestablishment of a community in which some, but not all, organisms have been destroyed. And this occurs after fires, storms, logging, etc. The legacy of pre-existing species and their interactions with colonizing species play larger roles than they do in primary succession. This is sort of the classic succession figure that you see, and you can see it starts with this primary succession, And we start with bare rock. We move through time where we end up with some lichen. And then we have these small annual plants and lichens, grasses and perennials. Eventually you get some grasses, shrubs, and these shade intolerant species such as pines. And then eventually you end up in this, quote, climax community where there's shade tolerant trees such as oak and hickory. And if there's a disturbance, you can't push this back. And this would be, if it starts, depending on where it starts over, we'd have secondary succession going on if there's a disturbance that pushes this whole community process back some. So that's sort of where I want to end with this quick lecture. I do have a book chapter about Clements and Gleason and an associated discussion about that. And the book chapter really talks about the two sort of ways that ecologists think about succession, and I think it's sort of an interesting read, and it has a lot to do with sort of the individuals and their culture that they grew up with and their sort of personal philosophies, which is sort of interesting because it sort of drives science a lot of times. And then we have a separate lecture that with an associated assignment about alternate stable states or alternative stable states. And so I look forward to seeing you guys here again soon and talking about more of this interesting ecological stuff that we're talking about.